The Four Noble Truths is the basic statement of the Buddha's teaching. These four truths are included in the content of the first discourse of the Buddha after his awakening, and the subsequent 45 years of his teaching career is basically filling in the details, a commentary on the Four Noble Truths. It's all in the Four Noble Truths, in the succinct statement. After the Buddha's awakening under the Bodhi tree, at first he was not inclined to teach. His mind was inclined towards just enjoying the bliss of enlightenment sitting under the tree. He thought it would be a weariness and a vexation for me. This generation of beings are attached to their sense pleasures. They will not want to hear this teaching. Will be difficult for them to hear. But then a powerful being, Brahma Sahampati, one of the Brahma deities, very refined level of being, appeared before the Buddha on bended knee and begged him to teach for the sake of those with little dust in their eyes. So the Buddha consented, and he turned his mind to seeing who in this world would be a suitable recipient for these teachings in the first instance. And he thought of his teachers that had, during his early years, there had been two yogis who had taught him various meditation techniques that started him on his path. And he decided at the time when he was studying with them, he decided that their teachings were incomplete. So he went on to his own search. But we should always have respect and veneration for our teachers, and the Buddha thought of them as the first worthy recipients. But when he turned his mind to find where they were, he realized they had both died in the interim. So he next thought of his companions in the years of his austerities. He had spent 6 years wandering and practicing austerities, and he had 5 companions at that time. And he saw that they were in the deer park at Isapatane near Varanasi. This is Sarnath in modern India, Savatthi. He then headed in that direction. And when he arrived at the deer park, the 5 ascetics, his companions, they saw him coming, and they said, "Here comes that backslider Gautama," because they had been practicing extreme fasting, and at the end he decided that was counterproductive, and he had taken a bowl of milk rice before his final meditation. So they thought that was scandalous, that he had been indulging in such luxuries. So they agreed amongst themselves. They saw him coming. Don't show him any respect. Don't get up to greet him. He's a backslider. But as he approached closer, and they saw the radiance of his face and the nobility of his bearing, they couldn't help themselves. They got up and they prepared a seat for him, and they brought him water to drink and water to wash his feet. And he sat down, and he gave the first sermon, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, to the 5 ascetics in the deer park. This sermon is very beloved in the Theravada tradition. It's often chanted. The whole sermon is often chanted as a recitation in the Pali. He began by teaching briefly on the idea of a middle path between hedonism and asceticism. He said there are these two paths in the world that don't lead anywhere. One is the path of sensual indulgence, which he called the low path of the village. And the other path that leads nowhere is the path of self-mortification, extreme asceticism. So one should neither seek pleasure nor pain, but practice the middle way. And then he, after this introduction, he then launched into the main theme of his talk, which is the Four Noble Truths. The structure of the Four Noble Truths is the truth of dukkha, or suffering, the truth of the origin of dukkha, the truth of the ending of dukkha, and the truth of the path leading to the ending of dukkha. The structure follows a scheme that would have been familiar to any reasonably educated person in India at the time. It follows the pattern of the medical texts of the day. This is something that the Buddha often did in his teaching career, was that he would take structures and forms from the existent culture and give them a new angle. So the idea with these medical texts was they would deal with a disease first by describing the symptoms, then the cause of the disease, then the prognosis, whether it could be cured or not, and then finally laying out a course of treatment. So the primordial disease of beings is dukkha, the disease that covers all others. We need to talk a bit about this word dukkha, because usually if you see English translations of the Four Noble Truths, it will be the first noble truth is the truth of suffering, sometimes expressed in English summaries as life is suffering. This is somewhat misleading and unfortunate, and tends to give the Buddhist teaching the reputation of being gloomy, pessimistic. I was asked once at a talk, somebody says, how come you Buddhists always talk about suffering all the time? And I said, that's not fair. We don't talk just about suffering. We also talk about pain, grief, lamentation, and despair. That was my sort of flip first answer. But what we really need to do is to look at this word dukkha. It's the English word suffering is really too narrow to cover the range of dukkha. Yes, suffering is dukkha, but not all dukkha is suffering. Because every moment of our existence, as in samsara, every conditioned experience that we have, everything that arises through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body is dukkha. But it's not all suffering. In this human existence, we have a mixture of painful sensations, pleasurable sensations, and a great mass of just neutral, boring, in the middle, neither pleasure nor pain. And even the pleasurable sensations are dukkha. And dukkha is not just a subjective reaction, it's an integral, objective part of the fabric of reality. It means that the things which arise in conditioned phenomena, manifestation, in the broadest sense, everything is in some degree deficient, imperfect, provisional, Nothing is absolutely perfect, ideal, completely satisfying. And it's not, as I say, this is not just a problem of subjective attitude, which sometimes people seem to think that's what the teachings mean, is that we're just looking at it wrongly. It's not just that, it's also that reality itself is flawed. Manifestation is itself an imperfection and will never be perfect. There's a line I come across once in a book about Tibetan Buddhism that put forth an interesting argument. It said that if there were one object anywhere in samsaric conditioned cosmos that were perfect and absolutely satisfying, the universe would have ceased ages ago, because all consciousness would eventually light upon that object and never move again. There's no reason for consciousness to move, to flit from object to object as it does, except for the unsatisfying nature of the objects. This is the built into the fabric of reality. This is the inherent basis of manifestation and of conscious existence, is the mind is trying to become satisfied with objects, mind taking an object, and it's never satisfied, and it moves on to the next one, the next shiny thing. And this is the primordial addiction of mind, taking objects. And this is explained in the second noble truth, which is the truth of the origin of dukkha. Dukkha samudaya, the origin of dukkha, which is tanha, craving or desire. There are three aspects or kinds of tanha. There's the craving for sense pleasure, which is easy enough to understand. The mind wants pleasant objects of the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body. And this is a primary motivating factor in the psychology of all beings at our level of existence, which is the sense desire realm. Primarily driven, unless we are very conscious and mindful, we're primarily driven by desire to experience pleasant sensations and to avoid unpleasant sensations. The second form of craving, of tanha, is the craving for being, bhava tanha, the craving for being or becoming. In its most primal form, this is simply the desire to exist. But it manifests as the desire to be greater than we are, to be more perfect, to be smarter, prettier, thinner, stronger, more famous, more wealthy, holier, better meditator, whatever, is desire to be. And in its, as I say, in its most primal, primordial form, is simply the desire to exist. Then there's the third kind of tanha, is the desire to not be. And in its most primal form, this is the desire for annihilation. And it manifests in a milder form for everyone all the time, alternately with the desire to be. Whenever you try and throttle down consciousness through oversleeping, vegging out in front of the TV, taking drink or drugs, overeating. There's many different strategies beings use to make themselves less conscious, because consciousness is perceived as a burden, and you want to dull it down. That's vibhava tanha, the desire for not being. So in its most extreme form, it's a desire for annihilation. In a milder form, it's just a desire to be less, and to curl up into a ball and just be less than you are, experience less, feel less acutely. Right? These three forms of tanha, these are the driving engine, the motor of conditioned existence, of samsara. This is what keeps us in being. We're chasing our own tails. We're like hamsters in a wheel in this existence. And the samsaric project is inherently endless. It's inherently pointless. It's an unwinnable game. It's like playing solitaire with a deck of 51. Right? There's an old song about that. Playing solitaire till dawn with a deck of 51. This sums up the samsaric existence. The third noble truth is the good news, the hopeful aspect, and it's what keeps Buddhist philosophy from being ultimately pessimistic. If we just stop at the second noble truth, we've got something like existentialism. But Buddhism doesn't say just life sucks, just deal with it. It says there is a way out. There is something other than this. There is an end of dukkha. And in his first sermon, the Buddha didn't go into really detail about this. He didn't explain it very much. He just said when tanha is ended, then suffering is ended. But in the course of later teachings, it's explained somewhat more. He's talking about nibbana, the unconditioned. All this realm that we experience, our human ordinary existence, is conditioned. Everything arises according to causes and conditions, and this is part of why it's dukkha, because everything is contingent, dependent upon other things. There is no self-standing, self-sufficient entity anywhere to be found. And it's an endless cycle, an endless cycling and recycling, and there's no beginning and no end to it. And while this cannot be made perfect, and while there cannot be found any ultimate happiness or ultimate satisfaction within the conditioned, there is an ending to it. There is an alternate. There is the unconditioned, the unmanifest, the unborn, the unmade. Nibbana, or nirvana in Sanskrit. Now, nibbana is impossible to define or express in ordinary language. There's another instance of the Buddha using forms from the culture. In one discourse, he was in conversation with an ascetic who asked him the question, phrased this way: does the Tathagata exist after death? The Tathagata being, in this context, a synonym for the enlightened being. one who has experienced Nibbana. So he's trying in this way to pin down what's the nature of Nibbana. He says, does the Tathagata exist after death? And the Buddha said, no, that does not fit the case. So he said, okay, well then, does the Tathagata not exist after death? And the Buddha replied, no, that does not fit the case. All right then, does the Tathagata both exist and not exist after death? No, that does not fit the case. Well, there's one left. Does the Tathagata neither exist nor not exist after death? No, that does not fit the case. Now that passage is using the system of Indian formal logic. Mathematical logic in ancient India was different than the logic developed in the Western world by the Greeks, which was a binary system expressed formally as either A or not A. In India, they had a tertiary system expressed as A, not A, both A and not A, neither A nor not A. Right? So it was a more subtle system, but it was one that was recognized, and an educated person would have seen what the Buddha was doing. He was expressing that the concept of Nibbana can't be fit into your logical categories. So this left the poor guy quite baffled, and so the Buddha, as he often did, he gave a simile. They were sitting by a fire, and he said, if this fire were to go out, and I asked you the question, has the fire gone to the north, what would you say? I say, well, that doesn't fit the case. That doesn't make any sense. Or if I said it went to the south, the east, the west, you would say the same. The question is meaningless. The fire hasn't gone to either north, south, east, or west, and the Tathagata, you can't say of him after death that he either exists or not, or both, or neither. It just doesn't fit the categories. Talking about Nibbana, we're talking about something that's beyond ordinary conceptualization. And there is a hint of this in that first sermon. When the Buddha talked about dukkha in the first truth, he said this truth must be understood. He used the Pali verb parijanati, which means to understand, to grasp fully. So the truth of dukkha, which is the truth of our ordinary existence, is something that the ordinary human conceptual mind can grasp, has the potential or the power to grasp and understand. But when he talked about Nibbana, he didn't say this is to be understood. He said this is to be realized. He used the verb sachikaroti, which means to experience for oneself. So it can't be understood or grasped with the conceptual mind, but it can be experienced. That is within our potentiality. Human beings have the potential of realizing Nibbana. And it's really the experience of Nibbana is what happens when we just stop doing samsara. To think of samsara as not as a place or a process really, but as something that we do, something that we choose moment by moment. We want that next shiny thing. We're not ready to give it up yet. The desire is still driving us on. But it's very, very much easier said than done. The attachment we have to samsaric manifestation and existence is the deep primordial addiction in the mind is very hard to break. And although in the end it's just that one simple movement of the mind, as it says in one text, it says the mind lights upon non-occurrence. It just stops doing that. That's really all there is to it. But to find our way there is not, usually it's not an easy thing to do. So the Buddha concludes the sermon with the Four Noble Truths. Of the Four Noble Truths, he concludes it with the fourth truth, which is the truth of the path to the ending of suffering, the Eightfold Noble Path, and lays out basically a lifestyle, a guide for bringing the mind into harmony with the unconditioned. And the first of the 8 steps of the path is samaditthi. It's usually right view. Sama, as translated right, really means more something like perfect or complete, fulfilled or complete or perfect. So to get away from the sense of right as in right and wrong, and think of it as perfected or completed or fulfilled. And ditthi is view, is the way we understand and view the world. And it's something more than just our beliefs or opinions. It's our underlying assumptions and the way we look at things. And right view can be defined, and it is defined in different places in the suttas in different ways. But in this first sutta, it's defined as having the view that's in accordance with the noble truths. So it's a circular kind of definition. If one views the world through the prism of the Four Noble Truths, then one has right view. Samasankappa is right thought or right intention, which is having thoughts that are based on kindness, generosity, wisdom, and renunciation. So if one has thoughts, wrong intention or wrong thought, or thoughts based on greediness and acquisition and cruelty and ill will, and these are wrong thoughts in terms of what leads us closer to liberation and awakening, and what brings us further away from it. Samavacca is right speech. And right speech is first of all defined as speaking that which is true. There are also other definitions: avoiding harsh speech, avoiding slander, and avoiding foolish babbling, defined as horizontal going, tirachanagama, meaning speech like an animal. This is foolish babbling, just sort of mouth noise. It's a waste of time. There's one place where the Buddha talks about the speech that a Tathagata would utter and not utter as a definition of right speech. First of all, whatever words a Tathagata speaks are true and never untrue. Secondly, they're always meaningful and not meaningless. And the word in Pali is atta, which means significant or important. It's one of those words that's very difficult to translate. In the Sanskrit tradition, they pair dharma and artha as two kind of aspects of right living. Atta, the Pali form, is not used as much, but it is used frequently, and it means that something has weight, significance, it's important, it has meaning, so that the speech that's uttered by a Tathagata has significance, it's not insignificant. And it's beneficial. The third factor is it's beneficial and not otherwise. It's always useful to the hearer. And the fourth one is interesting. It says that speech uttered by a Tathagata is always either pleasant to hear or spoken at the right time. So with a little contemplation, you can figure what that means. It's something, if you've got to say something to somebody and it's true and it's meaningful and it's useful for him to hear it, but he's not going to like it, then it's best to wait for the right time. Don't just blurt it out. Yeah. And deciding on the right time can be defined a little closer. There's a passage in the Vinaya which advises monks when to admonish another monk. And this could be applied to anybody, really. First of all, you should examine your own mind, and if you're going to admonish somebody, make sure you're free of that fault. If you're doing the same damn thing, that's you've got no right to talk. You need to shut up until you've cleaned up your own act before you criticize somebody else. Right, that's number one. The second thing, you examine your mind and make sure you're free of anger. And if you're not, wait till you've calmed down. And then you can criticize the person calmly and reasonably, point out what he's done wrong. And the third one, you need to use your best judgment to figure, is this person ready to hear what I have to say? If you think they'll just get defensive and it won't do any good, then you're better not to make matters worse. You're better just to hold your peace. So it's a pretty high standard for when you should criticize somebody. So there's different aspects of right speech. The next factor is right action, or perfect action, complete action, which is the factor of morality and with the body, and is defined as basically the same as the precepts: not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct. This is the right action with the body. And the next one is right livelihood, which is livelihood is how we feed our bodies, how we maintain ourselves in existence in the world. And there must have been a reason for including this. Logically, you could say it's not really necessary to include this as a separate factor, because everything we do in terms of livelihood is either with speech or body. So they're already covered by right action and right speech. But there must be an emphasis here, because how we maintain the body has a special, powerful karmic significance. And we should practice a livelihood that is beneficial and honest and fair to ourselves, to our clients, to our employers, to our employees. All these social factors have to be considered. And there are listed in not in the first sermon, but elsewhere, is listed of 5 livelihoods, trades that are considered wrong, inherently wrong, and to be avoided by Buddhist lay people. These are dealing in weapons, dealing in poisons, dealing in intoxicants, dealing in animals for slaughter, and dealing in human slaves. These are considered the forbidden trades. Then those factors, right, thought, speech, action, and livelihood, are considered factors of morality or sila or ethics. And the last factors relate more to mental development, to meditation. And these are the factors of right energy or right effort, probably is better, right effort, right samadhi, and right mindfulness. Right effort, samavayamo, is the effort to purify the mind. It's defined as 4 factors, as the effort to raise up wholesome states that have not yet arisen, to nourish and encourage those wholesome states which have already arisen, to prevent the arising of unwholesome states, and to work to diminish and reduce and finally eliminate unwholesome states that are already present in the mind. Right mindfulness, sammasati, is mindfulness of the body, feelings, mental states, and mental objects. These are the 4 foundations of mindfulness. The word sati was pretty much universally translated as mindfulness. I have heard one bhikkhu that I know, who's a senior bhikkhu, does a lot of teaching. He says he no longer uses the word mindfulness for sati because it's been so messed up in the culture. People have so many ideas about what it means that don't really apply to sati. This is actually a general problem, I think, in Buddhism. In popular understanding of Buddhism is hindered by misunderstanding of English words that don't quite match the Pali originals. The word sati is actually closely related to the idea of memory. And some older books translate sati as recollectedness, which is actually pretty good. The idea of if you have sati is that you remember to be present. And if you have sati, you remember stuff. This is the other side of it. There's one simple application in daily life. If you're always forgetting where you put your car keys or your pen or your glasses or whatever, that's because you weren't practicing sati when you put them down. If you put something down mindfully, you don't have to make an effort to remember where it is. You've registered it, and it'll come back when you need it. If you toss it aside while you're thinking about something else, you'll never remember where you put it. So this is a very small, immediate daily life application of the principle of sati. The way it works in the Buddhist psychology called Abhidhamma is that for a sequence of mind moments to register an object, you must be fully conscious. If you're not fully conscious, that last step in the process, the registration of the object, doesn't occur and it's lost to memory. So mindfulness and memory are closely related concepts. And we practice some formal meditation. One form of meditation that we do is vipassana meditation, which is the mindfulness meditation per se. And there are different forms of doing vipassana, but the underlying idea is that you try to make yourself fully conscious of each object as it arises in the mind. And there are different techniques for developing that, but the underlying principle is you make the process fully conscious. And this is what finally gets you liberated from samsara. As I said, the process is the primordial addiction of going for the next shiny thing. If you make that fully conscious, the process runs itself down because you're no longer fooled by it. You see, oh yeah, okay, just that again. And eventually that allows the mind to do the little sideways slip and not do that anymore. Yeah? And realize the unconditioned. The final path factor in the list is sama samadhi. And samadhi is really untranslatable. It's been often translated as concentration, but that's I really want to get away from that. That's, I think, dead wrong. Samadhi is the stability of mind, stillness of mind, and it's actually how it's defined in the commentaries is the non-wavering of mind. Is a mind still on a single object, filled with a single object, not moving. The ordinary mind in daily life is sometimes called the monkey mind, because it's like a monkey jumping from branch to branch. Your mind is constantly flitting from this to that to the other thing. You do a samadhi meditation, you choose a single object, such as the breath is a common object to choose. You choose the physical sensation of breathing and try and fill consciousness with that. And why I don't like the word concentration is because concentration implies a narrowing of the mind. And the mind with good samadhi is far from narrow. It's vast and spacious, but it's still. So the better way to think of it, it's often said, put your mind on the breath. I think a better way to approach it is to think, fill the mind with the breath. Keep the mind still, wide open and spacious. But let all that vast space be filled with a single object. And then this is samadhi. The mind's not moving. So this is the Eightfold Path, which is the path that leads to the end of suffering. After the Buddha had given this sermon, one of the 5 monks, and they are to be called monks now, they were the first followers of the Buddha, the beginning of the Sangha. One of them, Kandanya, he exclaimed, that which is subject to arising is subject to cessation. And the Buddha said, Kandanya knows, which in Pali is Anya Kandanya. And after that, his name was Anya Kandanya. And this is a very concise statement in the text, but it has a great power underlying meaning to it. What Kandanya said is an interesting statement because although it's quite in accord with many of the Buddha's later teachings, he did not say anything about that in the first sermon. So this was an independent penetration of reality by Kandanya. What he said doesn't follow logically from what the Buddha had said. So he had penetrated reality on his own during the sermon, and he uttered his own expression of Dhamma at the end of the sermon, and the Buddha recognized it and said, Kandanya knows. And when the Buddha had said that, the local devas, the forest devas, the Bhuma devas, the lowest level of spiritual beings, they set up a cry of rejoicing. They said that here in the deer park at Varanasi, the Buddha has turned the wheel of the Dhamma. Now this is why it's called the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, which means turning the wheel of the Dhamma. And when this cry was set up by the Bhuma devas, it was picked up by the devas of the lowest sensual heaven, the devas of the 4 great kings, and they set up the cry, the wheel of the Dhamma has been turned. And that was heard by the devas of the 33, the Tawatingsa devas at the top of Mount Sinaru. And they set up the cry. And then it went up through all the other realms, all the sensual heavens, and then up into the Brahma heavens. And the whole universe was filled with a brilliant light. 10,000 world systems were brilliantly illuminated. So this was a moment of great cosmic import. This is the most significant moment in the history of the world. It was not the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, but it was Kondanyo's realization, his opening of the Dhamma eye, the attainment of stream entry, independent realization of Nibbana, because this had meant that the Buddha had successfully transmitted the teaching. He had turned the wheel of the Dhamma. If he had not managed to successfully transmit the teaching, we wouldn't be here today talking about it. It'd be totally forgotten. So this was the moment that established that the Dhamma had been successfully transmitted. The wheel was turning, and no Samana or Brahma or Mara or Deva or Brahma can stop it from turning once it's been turned. So this is the Four Noble Truths and some of the background and associations with it, the teaching of it, and the significance of it. And I'll stop my formal remarks here, and we can take some time for questions and answers if you like.